Allahumma rzuqna al-ikhlas fil qawl wal amal. So now, alhamdulillah, we're in what I think is really the culmination of this surah. Two of the most, if not the most beautiful ayat in this surah, which is really everything finally now tying together and being solved. You're seeing the final conclusion in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. And so we entered into this, some of the reflections on this ayah last week, ayah 100, where Yusuf alayhi salam, he elevates his parents on the throne, and then they all, do fall in sajda to him, his parents as well as his brothers. And this is the fulfillment of his dream. And one of the things the scholars, they talk about in this ayah here is we talked about this already, but you really see what the end result of envy is. The end result of envy, that Yusuf alayhi salam, his brothers, how much they plotted and how much they did whatever they could to really take Yusuf down. They put him into the pit of a well, and it ends with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala insisting on nothing less than elevating Yusuf alayhi salam on the throne, with those same brothers now making sajda to him, right? And so Yusuf alayhi salam goes from being in a well to being someone who is at the heights and the pinnacle of success in this world and in the akhirah as well. And the message here that is stitched very clearly into this surah is that the envier will never win. The envier will never win. In fact, the envier, the only thing that they are hurting, or the only one that they are hurting, is themselves, right? They say this type of disease of the heart is one that burns the person before it harms anyone or anything else. You may think that your envy can stop someone, can slow them down, but ultimately, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants something for someone and wants good for someone, then who are you to stop that? Do you think that envy will stop that? And so it's a reminder, and we talked about this earlier in the surah, in the beginning, that the seeds of envy may be something that sprouts in the heart of the human being naturally. Right? No one wants to feel like they're less than someone else. You feel like someone's ahead of you in this world or whatever it may be. Why do they have that and I don't? But to remember this, right? That the path of success and the path of accomplishment is never through bringing someone else down. It's never through envying someone else. Because the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ultimately overcome, and they will get what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has planned for them, whereas the envier will not benefit at all. So instead of taking that path, to recognize that this is the seed, the cause of envy is something that's very ugly, right? And this is how we fight it within ourselves, to recognize that envy is going against or objecting to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And I know that's not something that anyone wants to have or in their life, that I'm upset or that I go against the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But rather, if you see someone who is ahead of you or someone who's being successful, make dua for them and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives you from His fadl as well. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's fadl is wasi'. It's vast and expansive. So for someone else to have something that you want, Allah Azza wa Jalla is more than capable of blessing them in that thing and giving you as well. Right? And as we see in the story, like we said, the envier will never win. So that's stitched into this ayah. No matter what they thought they could do to bring Yusuf down, it ends with Yusuf alayhi salam at the pinnacle of success. Right? So that's one thing in this ayah. Another thing that some of the scholars, they talk about here in this ayah is interesting. It's a subtle point, and I never recognized this point until it was pointed out to me. But one of the things, so Yusuf alayhi salam is enumerating some of the blessings of Allah on him. Right? He says, وَقَدْ أَحْسَنَ بِي, Allah Azza wa Jal has shown me His favor and His kindness and His excellence. And He mentions two things. And we talked about the first last week. إِذْ أَخْرَجَنِي مِنَ السِّجْنِ, when He took me out of prison. Right? That's clear. But then he says, وَجَاءَ بِكُم مِّنَ الْبَدُوِ, and he brought you from out of the wilderness. The Badu is like the desert, right? The middle of nowhere. And so some of the scholars, they pointed here, they said, this is not just Yusuf alayhi salam thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that there's been a reunion with him and his family. But also there's a subtle indication here to avoid the Bedouin life, yani being out in the wilderness. In our terms, being not having the right environment or surroundings around us, right? No one here is going to be going to live in the desert unless that's something that you want to do one day. But the idea here is the necessity of having a healthy and beneficial environment, right? While we're not talking about the physical desert, we could be talking about a spiritual desert, right? People, a lot of times, they move or they put their families and their children in places in order to ensure that they have the right type of, environment around them, whether it's the school that they put them in or the people that they encourage them around, or just even the place that they move. Many families move in order to ensure that, their families are in a good community, around good people. Just personally, in my own life, for example, my father, rahimahullah, kept our family in this area, not here in Naperville, but close by, because we were going to an Islamic school, right? And he wasn't working here in Chicago for a very long time. In fact, he was working, out of the state for the majority of that time. And he could have, if he wanted to, moved us all, and had us all relocate to wherever his job, dictated for him to be. But instead of that, because he saw the value of that stability of being around a good community and a good school and good people, he himself made the sacrifice of, okay, I will drive the 3 hours, or I will take the plane on a weekly basis and come back on the weekends in order for there to be an environment that is stable and that is suitable for not just academic growth and educational growth, but that spiritual growth, right? And we are, as a family, and many people like that, are indebted, to our families for making that type of sacrifice. So to ask ourselves this question of, how well situated is my family for this type of environment, to be exposed to khair, to goodness, to the wahi, to revelation, and to good role models in general, right? It's a very subtle point, but that's something I thought that was beneficial to mention here. Another thing that the scholars, they talk about, look at the words that Yusuf alayhi salam uses, right? So he says, وَجَاءَ بِكُم مِّنَ الْبَدُوِ, after he brought you from the wilderness, he said, مِن بَعْدِ أَن نَزَغَ الشَّيْطَانِ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَ إِخْوَتِي. We talked about one part of this, how he basically said it was the shaitan, right? He's kind of like, to ease that relationship, he's not saying you guys did this to me. He said the shaitan poked and had sown conflict between me and my brothers, right? Very beautiful language that he uses. But one of the things that the scholars, they point out is they say, look at the word he uses for what the shaitan did. He said, nazagha shaitan. Nazgh in Arabic means to poke. It means to poke, okay? Now, look at what was the result of just the poking of shaitan. Right? Just to be touched or pricked by shaitan, look at all the pain and the suffering and the havoc that it caused, right? In one part of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, Inna kayda shaitani kana da'ifa, right? That the plans, the schemes of shaitan are weak, okay? And that's true. But that's only the case when a person is protected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When a person is protected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? If the protection of Allah azza wa jal has been lifted, and if a person falls prey to the shaitan, then even the poke of shaitan can have disastrous consequences, right? But if a person is protected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the impact of shaitan is, as Allah describes it, the plots and the plans of shaitan are da'if, right? One of the scholars, he said this, he said, the servant lays exposed between Allah and shaitan. If Allah shelters him, shaitan will never be able to reach him. But if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala leaves him, then shaitan will devour him. Right? And that's the thing. Yani, yes, the plot of shaitan is weak, but without the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are much weaker. And with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we have the strength to be able to be protected from the shaitan. And another scholar, he would say, don't think that the enemy of Allah has triumphed, i.e. the shaitan. Rather, it was the guardian who turned away. Right? Meaning if a person falls prey to shaitan, that means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed for the shaitan to have that impact, and he has turned away from the protection of his servant, and that is something that none of us can handle, right? And then the end of this ayah, like we talked, we addressed or we mentioned in passing last week, but just to sit with it for a little bit, how he says, Inna Rabbi latifun lima yasha, that indeed my Lord is most subtle towards whomever he wills, innahu huwa al-alimul hakim. Two very, very beautiful points here, and I think we'll end with this, inshallah. There's the scholar Ali Al-Fifi, who wrote this work on Yusufiyat, these reflections from Surah Yusuf. He said something beautiful. He said, look, the entire Surah Yusuf, is about the lutf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the subtle mercy, the mercy that you may not always see right away, but that's always there. He says, whoever reads it and doesn't feel his lutf, Allah's lutf in his bones and flowing in his veins, has not really read the surah, right? And there's a quote that says, there are years that ask questions, and then there are years that answer those questions, right? In our lives, we experience this as well. There's moments where the question that is at the top of our mind is why? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow this to happen? Why did this, not go in my favor? Why did my family, did this happen to my family? Why? You can imagine much of the life of Yusuf alayhi salam, there is at the top of his mind this question of why. Why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowing these things to happen? And this is one of the most difficult questions as believers, to grapple with, right? When things are not happening in a way that we want them to have that question that is trying to jump out of why. And for Yusuf alayhi salam, it takes him until the end of his story, the end of his life, to learn the why, the answer to the why of why he went through the trials that he went through. And you can imagine in this moment, like being in the place of Yusuf alayhi salam and seeing his dream come to fruition. Can you imagine all of the memories that may flood back to his mind in this moment? Everything that he realizes in his life from the beginning had to happen in exactly that way for him to be in this position that he's in at that point, right? That's the year, or this is the time now where the answers are coming. Many years of his life is the question of why, but now here it culminates in the answers to those why, right? And the scholars, they say, you can just go through all of these different things that happen, and they have to happen exactly in this way for him to get to where he's at. He says, imagine, what if Al-Latif had not dissuaded the brothers from murder? He's asking himself these questions, you can imagine. Had not dissuaded them from murdering me or deserting me under the scorching sun. What if they had gone through with their original idea? Let's kill Yusuf alayhi salam. But Allah diverted them to, let's throw him in the well. What if Al-Latif had not inspired them to cast me into the well along that specific trade route where this caravan is going to come on its way to Egypt? What if Al-Latif had not relocated me to Egypt to protect me from what my parents could not? Right? The parents of Yusuf alayhi salam couldn't protect him from the envious brothers. But it's in the well that he was protected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What if Al-Latif had not allowed for a scandal that would imprison me, where I would meet the king's butler, display my ability in dream interpretation, and win the king's favor, right? To be in prison at that time with those particular people and give the interpretation of the dream to the butler of the king who happened to be in prison. What if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had not caused that butler to forget when he forgot and to remember when he remembered? Because imagine, think about it. If he had remembered, and there's so many of these what ifs, if he had remembered right when he got out of prison and told the king, by the way, there's someone in prison who's in there unjustly, and he interprets dreams, would the king have had a need or a reason for Yusuf at that time? No. So he's doing Yusuf a favor if he's going to give him any attention. But when does he remember? He remembers when the king is in his most pressing need, that he needs his dream interpreted. And so now Yusuf alayhi salam is the one who's in the position of strength. And Yusuf can dictate the terms alayhi salam. And the king needs him, and the king elevates him because of what he does for him. Every single moment. And in the scholars, they say, like, you can imagine, like if you saw this in a picture, right? How many invisible strands are coming together to make this beautiful picture in the life of Yusuf alayhi salam. And this, brothers and sisters, as much as it's difficult in the moment, this is how Allah Azza wa Jal works in our lives as well. Everything that happens, the ups and the downs, the forward movements and the things that pull us back, all of these, if we approach it in the right way, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving us this beautiful, beautiful conclusion, this beautiful story. As the scholars, they say, if you were to be able to see how Allah Azza wa Jal write or has written your story for you, right? And at the end of that story, if you were given a choice to go back and pick for yourself, right, the events that happened in your life, wallahi, you would never pick something except what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had picked for you in your life. And there would be no edits to the story in your life, because every single thing is chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a purpose. This is exactly what the story of Yusuf alayhi salam shows us in the most beautiful way, if we're able to reflect over it and then apply it to our lives. And then the final thing that he says is, he says, Inna Rabbi alimun hakim, that my Lord indeed is the most knowing, the most wise. And this to me is so beautiful, right? Why is this beautiful? Not just because he's remembering the names of Allah that apply to the situation here, but if you go back to the beginning of the story, the first few ayat of the story, when Yaqub alayhi salam is told the dream by Yusuf in the beginning of the story. And Yaqub alayhi salam advises Yusuf, don't tell the dream to your brothers in the shaitan, because shaitan is going to try to cause friction and problems. And then he tells him that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to show you his favor and these things. What does he say? He says, Inna Rabbaka alimun hakim. That your Lord, he uses the exact same two words. Your Lord is the most knowledgeable and the most wise. And it's decades later that Yusuf alayhi salam uses those exact same names of Allah. Right? As if, the scholars, they say, as if it was Yaqub who carved these names into the hearts of Yusuf alayhi salam, that carried him through his life and carried him through his journey. Right? And the message here is very beautiful. We may not always be there for our children, right? We may not be there to protect them in every single moment. There's going to be a time maybe where even we leave them in this world and they will be here in this world without us, right? But the one thing that you can instill in them that will protect them wherever they are is who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, right? The knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that will be much greater of a protection for them than any parent or any person can be. Right? And that's what Yaqub alayhi salam shows us here, and we see it manifested in this beautiful speech of Yusuf alayhi salam. And the next week, inshallah, we'll talk about my favorite ayah in the entire surah, ayah 101, where Yusuf alayhi salam now makes this beautiful dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the end of his story, and that's the end of the story. And then there's about a page left in other ayat that Allah Azza wa Jalla gives, and we'll try to talk about some of those as well. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who see his lutf in everything that he does in our lives. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect and to purify our hearts from any type of disease, from any type of envy, from any type of illness. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us and to guide us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he always decrees for us in a way that is going to bring us closer to him, in a way that is going to grant us his pleasure in this world and the next. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to join us together, us and our loved ones, in the best of places, in the highest levels of Jannah. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Jazakumullah.